Hello and welcome to Skeindeer Knits. My name is Ellie and I am a Norwegian living and knitting in London. And you can follow me on Instagram under Skeindeer, and you can find me as the designer Skeindeer Knits on Ravelry. But do make sure to join the Ravelry group Skeindeer Knits, which is the best place to take part in knit-alongs, potential giveaways, and get in touch, get help, pattern support, discussing Norwegian knitting and whatnot. It's a pretty good place to be, and I am very proud of the little community I have over there. And I am running a couple of knit-alongs. I'm running the year-long knit-along, where we aim to make 6 pairs of colourwork mittens for the duration of 2018. And I am running the Skeindeer sock-along, which is just about knitting one of my sock patterns for the duration of the summer. So I'm going to end that at the end of August, which is when my Selby Mitten Club is going to take over. And that is the second coming of the Selby Mitten Club. I've been having some thoughts about running that club again. For those of you who don't know, I had a blast with this pattern subscription club last year, which is a collection you can buy on Ravelry at the beginning of August, and you will get a mitten pattern coming every month up until Christmas. I did that last time and it was so much fun. People had lots of patterns coming out for them to gift knit or to themselves or to get into mitten knitting, and I want to do that again this year. But it might just be the last year that I do Selby mittens for the club, because I feel like there's still unexplored territory within the realm of Selby mittens. But I think maybe if I do this again next year, I might branch out and do other styles of mittens instead of just Selby mittens. But that is still something I'm thinking about, and of course I will be happy to hear your thoughts about that as well. 'Tis a very hot day here in London. I've had to shut the windows that really relieve most of the heat. I've had to shut off the fan that causes a lot of noise. But sadly I still have to keep one window open just to survive, so you will be hearing some construction noise from the ever noisy construction setup outside. That is just the routine of this podcast, so if you don't like intrusive noise, then I really have no way of dealing with that. But yeah, it is blazing hot. It's gonna reach up into 30 degrees in the shade today. For some of you that may not sound very hot. I promise you the experienced temperature in London feels a lot warmer than 30 for sure. Plus I also have a south-facing flat, so it becomes even warmer in here. It's like more like 40. But I do know that people who come from warmer areas do say that this feels warmer. It feels warmer here when it's warm. It's all the pollution and the dampness. Anyway, you don't want to hear about that, but I thought I'd explain in case I start melting on camera, then you know why. I just wanted to thank you also for receiving my Vesle Vinterfjell pattern so well last week. It was really fun to release my very first child-sized garment, and that is still available. The code may or may not still be available, and I also want to thank you for receiving my Greek sock pattern so well. That is, it's just been really fun to be able to publish some socks over the summer as well. I didn't really do that last year, and there's good reasons why, because it's not really the hot season in knitting. It's just hot everywhere else. And so yeah, just thank you for that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can find that in my Ravelry shop, and I'm going to link to the patterns below just in case. Gosh, there's just constant chainsaw noises outside. It's going to throw me off completely, as if the heat wasn't enough. Oh well. I have a few works in progress. I have been working on the Tenya, but you probably can't see the difference. I'm going to just show you briefly and not talk too much about it, but if you are curious about it, I did talk about it in the last 2 or 3 episodes. So this is Tenya. She's grown a little bit. Let me see if, yeah, that's, now you can see. It's knitted in Woolmeister lace, which I would argue is a light fingering weight yarn. It's in the Poison number 5 colorway. So that's the darkest shade of the Poison colorway. And I really like it. I have looked at the lace already just because I was curious to see how it would turn out, and it's really nice. So I am just on Stockinette Island. It's supposed to measure 40 centimeters when I divide for sleeves and well, divide for the front and back, I suppose. But I think I might just do that a little bit longer, perhaps. I don't know. It's too hot to wear it anyways. It's not like I have to make the decision ASAP. I am going to be referring to the heat all episode, so you have been warned. Well, the project that has been receiving the most amount of love this week, despite the heat, despite everything, yes, I managed to refer to the heat again, is my jadeite. I think that's how it's pronounced. So it's a cardigan I cast on last week. I just wanted to check out the shoulder construction, because this is from the Ziggurat book. So here's the book in question. I raved about this last week, so I'm not going to go into depth about that again. but it is from this book. She also has individual patterns on Ravelry, which I believe also are following the same construction method. And I just decided to cast on a Aran weight cardigan just to get a sense of the construction method fairly quickly, given, you know, it's a thick, heavy yarn. I was totally prepared for this to become a UFO. I didn't think I would actually commit to it. I just kind of wanted to try it out. I was curious, and I'd gotten this bargain yarn from my local yarn shop. I got this Joe Sharp, I think, merino cashmere silk yarn. It's a charcoal tweed yarn and it's beautiful, and I can't really stop knitting with it. So not only have I divided for the sleeve and body, and I've gotten the button band here. I think I had that last time as well, actually, come to think of it. But yeah, I am working up a sleeve here, as you can see. The pattern actually says that when you've knitted basically as far as I have with the body right now, you can start making some bust darts to increase for the bust, because it tells you to choose your size based on your shoulder width, so that kind of measurements from seam to seam. And I did that, but that means actually I would have had to go up a size for my bust. So I will be putting in those bust darts and get that slightly bigger, because apparently my shoulders are more narrow than my bust. That's the thing. And it's really just, yeah, clear and helpful about that in the book. But I was ready to join the next skein when I basically only have like this much, when I was going to do the bust dart, and that is when the pattern says, if you are stretching your skeins, maybe you want to do the sleeves first. And since I have absolutely no way of replacing this yarn, of buying more of this yarn, I thought might just do that. So I've actually done one sleeve already. You can see it's got like a fake seam here made by garter stitch, and I finished it. And it has a nice little feature on the other side. A nice little feature, that's right. It's a good thing I bought two colors of this yarn, because look at that. Like, this entire cardigan is charcoal except this little bit here, which does mean I will have more ends to weave in, but I guess I can live with that. So I don't know, I really like that. It's such a small feature in this entire thing, but I just, yeah, I really fell for it. And it was a nice way to kind of mix it up a little bit once you've gone way into Sleeve Island and you're kind of fed up and you know you still have this much to go. And it's actually quite nice to do it a little bit differently. So I'm doing the second sleeve. It's already zooming through. I've done a little bit this morning as well, just to wake me up. That's kind of how my day goes. And I believe I will have enough. I have one big skein and one medium skein. They all come in different sizes. I think it's something that's been ripped out and wound up. So I have that left, so I think I'll have enough. So that is pretty much all I have to say for that. I have been really enamored with this entire construction method. I've been curious about it for years. I always had her patterns in my queue or in my Ravelry wish list or whatever. I even bought some and I have some in my library. It's always been like something I am ready to do, but I have never really got around to it. And so I really have hair everywhere. Oh, just brushed my hair, that's kind of what happens. So I'm really glad that I've had a go at it. And what's more is that I have been thinking about maybe borrowing some ideas for this onto my own designs. So I was really curious about this first, like, how can I do that? Is that okay? And then I checked her website, and she does actually encourage designers to incorporate this particular construction method into their patterns, provided she gets credit for this incredible method. And that I'm not very, you know, difficult to ask there, because I think it's brilliant. I mean, there are so few ends to weave in for this entire shoulder piece, which is so different from pretty much any other construction method that does a top-down satin sleeve design like this one. Oh, I really like it. You'll probably see this again more, but I'm going to tell you about the design that I am working on, because I did try to incorporate this design into my own. But as you know, I am not particularly keen on purling, nor am I a big designing in stockinette. Like, I have one design coming up in pure stockinette and I'm not opposed to it, but I am the, you know, colorwork Skeindeer, right? And I don't like purling in colorwork either. So I am making not a ziggurat, but like a a steekrut. Is that catchy? A steekrut? Steekrut? Zig-steek? Do you know when you have a good word for this? It's basically a ziggurat that you steek. It will have more purling in some aspects because I don't want to have color work going across the sleeves in this particular design. But aside from that, it's pretty much done in the round. First with a bit of magic loop, and then you can find yourself a shorter circular, and then you can get the longer one, and then yeah. Now I'm gonna show you instead of babbling on about it. This is the cardigan, and I know Ellie's gone mad, right? No, this is my size, and these are the shoulder caps. This is the back of the neckline. You can see that it's pretty long actually if I stretch it out from all the way around here, the back. And this little steek here is actually connecting this bit here to this bit here. It's not the opening of the cardigan, it is the opening of the neck. So if you ever choose to do this design whenever it should come out, you're gonna have to follow it a bit blindly for a long while. So, because it's not gonna look like anything sensible. You're gonna have a long strip for the back. Sorry, that was the front. For the back, you work up one shoulder, you make a steek for the armhole, you work up one front, you go a bit back and forth, and you go all the way around to the other front, and you work that, so you have a bit shorter shaping. That's kind of how you work all of these. Then you go around and work the other shoulder in the back, you go a bit around, back and forth, and then you go all the way around and you make a steek for the front and you knit in the round. So you're gonna have no idea what you're doing for the longest time, but then at some point you get to cut up in the steek, and you get to cut up the armhole and that armhole, and then the front steek. This is the actual like steek where you will be cutting off the front of the cardigan to have button bands and whatnot. When you open all that up, you suddenly have a garment. It's like a butterfly coming out of a cocoon. It's gonna be so good. I'm very excited about this. I'm not usually I guess it's fair to say that I'm quite conventional about pattern construction. Like the most rogue I will go is going top down, and this is quite a different journey, and I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to be really good, and I'm doing all the maths and the grading right now. Pattern is kind of sort of already being written up. It's hard to size grade this thing for a variety of reasons. So it's gonna have maybe fewer available sizes. I'm not sure yet. I'm gonna try to be size inclusive, but bear in mind that yeah, it's hard. Doing my best. Definitely gonna like cry on the shoulder of my tech editor to make sure that it's all good. Gosh, I really hope you can't hear that noise. It's just the most screeching sound in the world. It's so nasty. But there's no way I can record later than this because it's gonna get just hotter and hotter, and that is when you will find me in my local Costa because they have air conditioning. But I'm not done talking about this thing yet. I am having some color issues because I'm now ready to join with the other color that I'm working color work with, and I can't make up my mind. I ran a poll on Instagram and there was clearly one winner. I'm not sure if that's the one I want to be the winner anymore, but before I put that poll up I was completely 50-50, and now I want to go with the opposite of the majority. Why do I do this? It's like when someone tells you one thing, that's when you want to do the other, just out of spite. So the colors in question are these. These are both Usk by Hillesvåg, one of my absolute favorite yarns. So the way this will work is that this will become kind of the background color of the contrast color that will be in this yarn. So when I join this will kind of work, I guess, kind of like a stripe. And one is a white grey, it's quite marbled, and one is an unbleached white. And this has won on the polls. It seems to have the majority vote. It's quite heathered, I guess. Marbled might not be the word. And I'm leaning towards the unbleached white because this particular cardigan design is going to be quite vintagey. And I'm wondering if this icy, cooler color might give it a bit too much of a modern look. So maybe this is actually what I should have realized myself. I don't know. So just to give you a comparison of the actual color that it will be used with. Right. So I think this one does look really nice with the burgundy. It's like very conventional choice for me, right? Just going with the grey. But do you think this might just highlight the whole vintage idea? I don't know, guys. This is really hard. I haven't decided still. I may sound like I've gone for this, even though everyone said this. Not everyone, like 2 out of 3 went for this. I don't think I could go wrong with either of those. Maybe, I don't know. I did actually a live stream on Instagram yesterday. I did a really long one, and I just went on and on and on about it. I just can't decide. The pains of designing, you guys. Don't tell anyone that this is fun. Just, ugh. Regardless, I am very excited about this design. I have a couple of garment designs looming already, so it may not be the first one to come out, but it's one that I'm very eager to try out construction wise right now. I think it's going to be, you know, a fitted cropped cardigan, but I'm also considering putting in a sort of simple guide to just make it a full length and not fitted as well, just because some might want that, even though the very like conceptual idea I have of this cardigan will definitely have more of that kind of vintage fit. So that is all I have for knitting this week. That didn't take more than like 15 minutes, did it? I am gonna mainly in this episode talk about gauge. That will come at the very end of the episode. So before that, I have just a couple of things to go through. One is an acquisition I forgot to mention last week. I'd already bought it then, but for some reason it was in a pile of books. I'd forgotten I bought it. This is when you know you should download the book purchases. Just a smidge, Ellie. Just a smidge. Anyway, I got this book. This is CoCoKnits Sweater Workshop. Another top-down innovative construction method that I am very curious about. I'm gonna see if I can find a good photo to illustrate the idea that they've come up with here. So it seems to me like you work a back piece first and then you join with some fronts, and then eventually you manage to put in some sleeves there that you work with the entire body. So it's not that different from the ziggurat, but it looks like there's a bit more joining here and there, but it seems like, I don't know, it seems like the happy medium between the actual satin sleeve design that it's workshopped down and the ziggurat. It so sits somewhere in the middle. That's the best way I can conceptualize it. I'm very curious about it. I might have a go with my bulky weight Knit Picks yarn. That could work out a sweater like this fairly quickly, just to get a sense of the construction, because I'm just really into exploring different construction ideas right now. I think that's just really intriguing. And yeah, this book has been in my local yarn shops for a long time, and I never really thought it was my thing. I looked through it, I'm like, I don't really care for any of the patterns that much, it's not really my style. Then I realized it's not the point of the book. The point of the book is to introduce this completely new and different construction method, and it's, you know, top down and working the sleeves in one go, so really it's quite right up my alley. I don't know if I will love this more than a ziggurat method, but there's only one way to find out, and that is to try it. So that is CoCoKnits Sweater Workshop. It's not exactly a review, but a rationalizing of why I bought it. If there are any other kind of books like this, or the ziggurat, or, you know, the Elizabeth Dorothy book of the satin sleeve, if you know about any of those that I don't know about, that introduces new and exciting top-down methods, then please do let me know. I have a couple of books now. Since I have all the books around anyway, I might as well show you what I'm talking about. These are kind of my top-down construction books right now. So this is the ziggurat book, which is primarily a pattern book, but it does also introduce the construction method. Same with the top-down Reimagining Satin Sleeves by Elizabeth Dorothy, also introduces her particular sleeve construction that comes with a lot of lovely patterns in Quint & Co yarn. And of course the CoCoKnits book. And we have the top-down sweaters by Anne Budd. I won't say that any of these are like new and innovative, but it's a very nice tool to have if you want to design garments with either of these construction methods, being a raglan, a yoke, saddle shoulder. I wonder if it also does the more Barbara G. Walker satin sleeve design. I'm not sure about the last one, but I think it also has some, I don't remember. Don't quote me on all the styles that come in here. But yes, I really love those kinds of books that kind of allows me to explore pattern constructions without, you know, looking at people's actual patterns, because as I've said before, patterns are not references. Like, yes, you can learn a lot from knitting other people's patterns and reading other people's patterns, but I think if you like write a pattern and you have someone else's pattern side by side, you can inadvertently take a bit more than you intend, and that's not really what patterns are for. That's why, you know, resources like this exist. So it's something to be wary of. And so yeah, if you have any recommendations for similar type books to this, I would love to hear them. Now I have a bit of an announcement to make. I'm gonna do Vlogust. August. I've decided to call it Vlogust. I don't know how catchy this is. It's vlog every day in August. Yeah, I feel like I've just missed vlogging a little bit, and my life isn't very exciting, but I am going to try to do a few exciting things in August. I am going to Oslo on the 10th, hoping to stay for a week, hoping to meet up with knitters, hoping that there are some knit nights maybe that I can attend, something like that. Yeah, just complete knitting tourism, because Oslo is one of my favorite knitting cities. And I need to just get away for a bit. And I'm actually not going to my usual, you know, place in Norway this summer. That's the first time I'm not going to Trondheim in the summer, where I'm from. So I thought I'd get a different Norway dose this time. So that is something I will include. I'm also going to try to include Fiber East that's coming up this weekend, because I want to be a bit ahead with this vlog. It's not going to be like the advent calendar type vlog that I did in December. I think the videos may not correspond with the day they come out, because that's just going to be stressful. So if I'm 4 days ahead, I think I'll look at my calendar. Fiber East is on the 28th, so that means I will be 4 or 5 days ahead, which I think will work for me, and I can fall behind a bit without it ruining everything. So that means everything will go, and that will be fun. And if you have any thematic videos you want me to bring up, then that would be great, but bear in mind, a vlog is not knitting videos. I don't want people to feel like they have more stuff that they have to keep up with when it comes to the whole Skeindeer Knits thing. Vlogs are vlogs. They are, you know, just daily journals. They may or may not tap into knitting, but that's not the point. So if you only are here for the knitting, I don't expect you to keep up with the vlogs. Honestly, that's just, there's no point in that. It's just for people who want a bit of a bonus content, I suppose. But if you have any special content that you want me to touch upon, it could be like anything from, yeah, knitting to, I don't know, my favorite books or music, or walks about in London, or animals, or like whatever, like anything under the sun that can be personal or knitting related or geographical. Yeah, things you want me to do in London, and things you would like me to do in London or Oslo. Maybe I should get out of the house more, hoping the heat wave will have died down a little bit by then, so I can actually function outdoors. We can only hope. And yeah, totally just put your suggestions in the comment section below, and it's, you know, if you don't comment on YouTube, then there's the questions, suggestions and answers thread on my Ravelry group. I just knocked my hand onto the table. I don't know why I did that. Anyway. Thank you all so much for your comments on my last week's episode where I mused about gatekeeping. I hope I managed to present a more nuanced view on my thoughts about it, when I do think gatekeeping is a serious issue, and I don't like when some knitters are made to feel like they don't belong, like they're not welcome, because they're knitting something that is considered of either a lower quality or a lower price point. And I also don't like when something that someone says is taken to mean gatekeeping when it's actually not, when it's someone just stating their preference. So I hope I managed to get all these points across properly. It seems like I did. I didn't have as many misunderstandings this time as previously, so that's good. And sometimes I wish that I started podcasting like 2 years earlier than I actually did, because back then I still think I made stuff that impressed people a lot, but I used very, very cheap yarns. I only used very affordable commercial yarns, and to some extent I still do, right? I'm not really a big luxury knitter. I will always front quality affordable yarns, because I don't think, you know, knitting is only for those that can afford certain things, and knitting is also for those that may not be as engrossed in it as I am, and will also want to make other priorities. So thanks for your thoughts and feedback on that. It was really, yeah, quite enriching. So, as I'm sure a lot of you know, I am going up to Perth Festival of Yarn in September, and I am going to be in the podcast lounge, but I am also going to be teaching a class, and I haven't really talked that much about the class here. You know, the podcast lounge is going to be business as usual. I'm just going to show up and be me, and you can come up and say hi, and then we just knit, and that's kind of how that works. Just beware that I am my usual dorky self, and sometimes I go mute, and it's, yeah. But for the class, I will be with the teacher, and I will be teaching you about knitting yoked sweaters. So I'm kind of targeting this towards people who have like a vague idea of what a yoke is, that, you know, you knit 3 tubes, put it together into 1 tube that you decrease up to the top. That is the yoke. So with my Mary sweater as an example, this is the very typical construction method. I'm not going to be like, you know, revealing anything naughty about someone else's pattern obviously, but it's a very typical construction method, right? One big tube for the body up, two smaller tubes for the sleeves up, you increase and increase and increase, and then you put them all together, work up the yoke, and you do color work while you decrease up to the neckline. And there are several both subjective and objective issues that I have with this method. One is I like top down, and so I'm going to talk about how you can just take a conventional yoke pattern and turn it top down. I will be talking about modifying things such as this ridiculously huge neckline. This is something you will find a lot in commercial patterns because they work their patterns up by pure maths and not always trying. So they have this rule that this is like the 100% of your stitch count, and then you'll have 40% up here. And obviously 40% up here is going to be more and more stitches the larger your bust size. But you don't have a wider neckline just because you have a wider bust size, so yeah, I don't like that. So that's basically a very conventional garment construction method. Note that it also doesn't have any shaping for the back. I have just hung this so that it looks like it does, but really it's just like this. It will dip very low in the neckline. And I'm not dissing the Maris pattern. This is very, very typical for any sort of traditional commercial yoke pattern. Bottom up in 3 pieces, the decreases to a very wide neckline with no shaping. So I'm gonna kind of take that as our starting point and see what can we do about this. How can we make this into something that is perhaps a little bit more enjoyable to knit and flattering. Now of course I wouldn't be a designer if I didn't employ those suggestions into my very own patterns. So I've got 2 of my garment patterns here, and I'll show you some of the ideas that I like to incorporate. First, it's top down. I wanted a very snug neckline here, so it really does have that, and then it's got a few fairly rapid increases in the beginning, and then it sort of slopes a bit, but it has enough to make it, you know, increase at an appropriate rate. This is, by the way, the shape you want in a colorwork yoke, if you ask me. You want it to kind of go out so that when your arms are moving you can do this, but no problem. I don't like when a yoke is shaped down, you know. If you, instead of getting this shape, you kind of just get this shape. You know, you want that extra little arm room. But that should be part of the pattern. If it's not, then we have a bigger issues on our hands. And yeah, top down, but so you'll see a little bit of shorter shaping for the neckline so that the neckline stays up higher than the front. And there are 2 ways of doing this, and I'll be covering both. There's one that we have it in the top, but there's also one where you may want to have it in the bottom, because if I had had it in the top here, that would have sort of disrupted this. I think they would have sort of dipped further down and it would look a bit odd. I did sneak in some here, but you can't really tell because it's in this color. But here you can see there's lots compared to the front. But unless you're like actively, you know, looking for it, I don't think it will be immediately obvious, and it sort of just looks like it's part of the design. And it does raise the neckline, as you can see. So that is one very big part of modifying a yoke pattern that I will be covering. Then of course there's fitting for your actual body, not just wearing a big box. Actually fairly straightforward. So I'll be going through some of the simple maths with you and you can sort of get an idea of how to fit a garment. Not from like a tailoring class point of view, but just as a very simple, anyone can do this kind of way. So that is just a teaser of some of the things I will be covering. I'll be covering some actual hands-on techniques such as German short rows. I think that's all I'm going to spoil for that class for the time being, but hopefully that piqued your interest if you're going to the festival, so you can sign up for that if you so wish. Now we are ready for the last bit of this episode, where I am going to talk about gauge. This is not going to be a kind of a bottom-up discussion class about gauge. I'm going to assume that you know the very basics of gauge, and I'm going to kind of build on top of that. So this is not going to be a completely entry level, but I'm going to try to cover some main grounds as I go through this as well. So hopefully it's going to be for everyone, but I just kind of wanted to let you know that I am hoping to take us all to the next level of gauge wisdom. So it's mainly going to be a way of tackling misconceptions about gauge. I hear a lot of things being said about gauge that I'm just like, no. So that is kind of, I'm just going to purge. I'm just going to get some release, some catharsis from all my gauge upset. So yeah. So when I put up a question on my Instagram stories about this, I got a lot of questions that revolved around either swatching or blocking. And like, swatching and blocking are relevant, but it's not the same as gauge. You know, people seem to talk about gauge and swatching in particular as though they're interchangeable terms, as though they are the same thing, and they aren't. Gauge is basically important way beyond just swatching. Like, yes, you swatch to check your gauge, but you may also swatch to check the colors that you use, whether they work together. You may swatch to check if you like, oh, I don't know, the texture. There's lots of reasons to swatch. Swatching is just testing out the actual garment and the fabric and features about it. It's not just for gauge, but it is for gauge as well, of course. That's why we call it a gauge swatch. So just to say it in a different way, it's not that gauge matters because you swatch. You swatch because gauge matters, and gauge will matter even if you are making something where you don't have to swatch. And this is why people get mixed up, I think, because they think, oh, gauge, yeah, I only swatch for garments. I'm like, but your shawls will still have gauge. If you plop a ruler on your shawl, you will be able to measure your gauge. If you knit at a tighter tension than, say, oh, I don't know, Stephen West, you will get a smaller shawl than Stephen West did, right? That is basically what gauge is. Gauge is still going to affect your work, whether you swatch or not. We swatch because it affects our work, and it affects the fabric that you get, because gauge is essentially your fabric, and that's going to be the main message of this little video. So yeah, I just want people to understand that little bit. So let's tackle the #1 pet peeve misconception that a lot of people submitted on Instagram, and it's totally my #1 as well. I'm a gauge knitter. I knit normal. My gauge is normal. No, there is no such thing. You need to stop saying that right now. That is not how knitting works. The only way that you may have that experience is if you have only knitted from designers who knit with the same tension that you do. So they have designs that say, oh, to get a 26 stitch gauge, so 26 stitches within 4 inches or 10 centimeters of width, that will give you, that means you will have to use a 3mm needle to get 26 stitches within that range. And if you get 26 stitches when you use 3mm, then you and that designer are knitting at the same tension. I am not gonna get 26 stitches to the 4 inch to the 10 centimeters. I knit at a different tension. But if I only knit from designers who get a count of 30 stitches within 10 centimeters, if I only knit from designers that do that with a 3mm, I would be thinking that I'm a gauge knitter, right? But all designers knit with different tensions, just like knitters, and they'll be writing up the needle size they used to get the gauge of the pattern. So you can't be a gauge knitter. That is impossible, because all designers have different tensions, and there isn't actually any official this needle size gives that gauge standardization. Like, some companies may operate with that. Like, it seems to me that a lot of, say, Norwegian knitting companies that have their own designs, they may operate by the same rule. So they say that you will need a 3mm to get a 26 stitch gauge, and then Sandnes says that, and then Dahl says that, and then Rema says that. And if those are all that you knit, you may get the experience that you're a gauge knitter, but you're not. It's just the fact that these companies operate by the same, you know, spreadsheet that they made themselves of gauges. So hopefully that has maybe resolved that misconception a little bit, because it is just not possible. It's not true. At some point you will find yourself having a pattern. Well, you will have to use a different needle size than the pattern says, because you only have one tension, but there are a vast array of designers out there, and they all have different tensions. Hope I didn't sound too aggressive in that one, but that is just like a big no. And related to that is the thing I hear sometimes, which people say, I only use the recommended needle size of the pattern. And that pertains to the point that I just made. That needle size will give you a gauge resulting from your tension. The needle size is not going to result in a default fabric that everyone gets using that needle size. That's not how it works, because some people knit tight, some people knit loose, and it's all relative. there isn't any formalized definition of tight knitter. There isn't a formalized definition of loose knitter. If anything, we probably all follow along a normal distribution. Like you can imagine a curve, kind of shaped like me, right? And it levels off, and this is the very, very tight knitter. This is the very, very loose knitter. And there's probably a bunch of people in the middle who I guess knit normal, but we don't know what that is. Nobody's done the research and measured this and found out, and it will be very complicated, and it will depend so much on needle material and yarn material and texture, and it's just not possible. All right, so let's just abandon the idea of normal knitting, as well as abandoning the idea that a needle size will always result in the same fabric, because it won't. Me using a needle size is probably going to be different than you using that very same needle size. So don't just read a pattern and go, 4mm needle, cast on. Unless, of course, you really don't care whether you get the same fabric, the same gauge or not. That is completely legit. But if you do care, then make sure you knit to this right gauge. I'm not going to say make sure you swatch, because there are various routes to get to gauge. You can just know. You just know your tension, you know what kind of needle size you usually need to get gauge with the material of the yarn that you use, or you may just want to cast on and measure as you go and rip out if it's wrong. Totally fine. But don't just read the needle size in the pattern. I really like the kind of Elizabeth Zimmerman approach to this, where the pattern just says, choose the needle size that gives you the right gauge. Off you go. I love that, because a pattern shouldn't really state needle size, but it's something that you have to write. Your tech editor is going to be angry with you if you don't want to write needle size, and so will your knitters, because they don't know where to begin. So I like to write needle size as a secondary thing. So I will say, use this and that needle size to get this and that gauge. I used this needle size to get gauge there, and that needle size for the color work gauge, and so on and so on. But you may differ. Here's another hypothetical example of what you may need. Just put it secondary, not too much text. I kind of struggle with keeping it condensed sometimes, but yeah, needle size is secondary to gauge, but that doesn't mean that you have to get the pattern's gauge. I'll get into that as well. So there's another misconception I often get, which baffles me, and that is, I can't get gauge. I honestly keep swatching and I'm using the recommended needle size and I can't get gauge. You have to change your needle size. You can't just swatch and swatch. I'm like, oh, I'm going to knit a bit looser with this swatch. I'm going to knit a bit tighter with this swatch. You're supposed to change your needle size when you swatch. And understand, like, you may not know this. Maybe nobody ever told you. So I'm telling you now, you need to change your needle size for every swatch you make to find out what needle size you need to choose, because you aren't supposed to choose the needle size that the pattern says. That's why patterns often say suggested needle size. So try out different needle sizes. Don't change how you knit. How you knit is fine. It's fine if you're a tight knitter. It's fine if you're a loose knitter. It doesn't matter. Just choose the needle size that gets you the gauge that either the pattern says you should get or that you want. And I want to touch upon the phrase I can't get gauge as well, because that is something I hear a lot and I don't understand what they mean. Because what gauge are you getting? That is the more important question. Let's say you're trying to achieve 24 stitches within 10 centimeters, okay? What gauge are you getting if you can't get that gauge? You know, don't say, oh, I didn't get 24. I can't get 24. Did you get 23? If so, good. If you got 23 at one swatch and 25 at the other, there isn't a needle size in the middle that could give you 24. Well, okay then. Okay. So, choose just one or the other, right? Do you want to go a bit looser than the recommended fabric, or do you want to go a bit tighter? If you want a bit tighter, go with 25. If you want a bit looser, go with 23. Now, this may alter the actual size of your garment, of course. So let's say you're choosing, let's say you're doing my Vinterfjell, and you're going with the bust size measurement. Well, scroll down to the pattern where it says the stitch count for the bust, and take that, and instead of dividing it by 2.4, which would have been the gauge of the pattern, which would have given you the actual bust measurement, take that stitch count and divide it by, say, 2.3 if that's what you went with, or 2.5. You will then get the centimeter measures for your bust. Convert that to inches if that's what you prefer, but like, you will then know what size that will give you, and if that is too small, you can do a different size. If that is too big, or too small. I don't know, you can go with the other gauge. Like, you have a plethora of options there. You don't actually have to get the exact gauge always. And if you can't, that doesn't mean that you can't knit it. You just have to kind of finagle around it. Like, I don't know why, but I struggle to get odd number gauges. I always get an even numbers. If a pattern says a 25 stitch gauge, I'm like, well, do we want to go loose or tighty on this one? Because 25 isn't happening, 27 isn't happening, which is annoying because that's like the gauge of that Mario sweater and a couple of other things that some this does. Can't get 27. I can get 28, I can get 26. 27 never happened, and so I will often just opt for one or the other and maybe check with the stitches if that is the size that I can wear. Usually it is. It's not really a huge difference with one stitch when you are up on that kind of gauge. If you're down to like a bulky weight sweater where you have like 13 or 15 stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches, then maybe you want to do some more serious maths there. So related to this, I keep talking about all these numbers and they may not mean anything to you. I got some questions about how do you just know your gauge? How do you seem to have this memorized? I knit a lot and I often use the same yarns. I use non-superwash yarns. They're often woolen spun and 2 plies. They're often this, yeah, or they could be DK weight maybe. There might be worsted, like it. I seem to come back to the same yarns. And so I made a table in Excel. I'm going to put it up here in front of my face so you can see. I have basically taken and measured pretty much everything I've knitted and found that every time I go to the next available needle size, I get 2 more stitches. So if I am doing a 3mm needle on stockinette, I get 30 stitches through 4 inches or 10 centimeters. If I want that to be tighter, 32 stitches is my next, because that's what I get on a 275 needle. Same thing if I am knitting with a 3mm needle to get a 30 stitch gauge and I want to do some color work. Well, if I do color work, I am suddenly then gonna get a 32 stitch gauge, so I will actually have to go to a 325mm needle to get a gauge with color work. Now be very careful about this because you don't want that gauge difference to be due to tight floats. Make sure it's just due to other reasons. For me, it's just that I tension the yarn differently when I hold 2 yarns. It's just a result of how I knit it differently. I think it's just the extra strand is being tensioned a little bit tighter, and that's just the result. And I have found that going to the next needle size always gives me that result. So if I am working with a 5mm needle for, say, an Icelandic yoke, that's usually a 5mm needle for me. They often have an 18 stitch gauge, like Ridadi for instance. When I do the yoke, I actually go up to a 5.5 to get the same gauge for the color work yoke. But before I move on, I also want to talk about the issue again with I can't get gauge. So you see that table that I have made for myself? Well, I also made a table for a hypothetical loose knitter. Someone who gets a 24 stitch gauge with a 3mm needle, whereas I have to use a 3.75. So I put those side by side and you can see that actually they can't get gauge. If they need a 36 stitch gauge in stockinette, there isn't a thin enough needle size available. I don't know, there might be thin needles than 1.75 out there. I haven't seen them. Please don't like correct me. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that it doesn't exist here. This loose knitter can't knit tighter than 34 stitches to 10 centimeters. So yes, it sometimes is true that you knit so loose that there just isn't a small enough needle out there, or you knit so tight that there isn't a big enough needle out there, but you can get gauge-ish, you know, as long as there's a thin enough needle size out there. And then sometimes I hear people say, oh, but I don't want to go down to a 2mm needle to get a 32 stitch gauge. Oh my god, that's so small. And I'm like, oh, I use a 3. And like, oh, you're so lucky, it's going to be so much faster for you. I'm like, no. You're knitting to the same fabric. It's not faster for me. I just need a different needle size than you. It's not like I get to do something quicker. Just because you had to go down to a 2 and I had to go up to a 3, there isn't actually any difference in how quickly we can finish this thing and how tedious it's going to be. Yes, it may be annoying to actually handle a smaller needle. I can understand that. But we are on equal grounds then if we're all getting the same gauge. And I also got a question about, well, how come you keep using the same yarn with all these different gauges, right? I used Finull for Vinterfjell, the sweater that has a 24 stitch gauge. So that's kind of a gauge commonly associated with sport weight yarn. And I also use that yarn for my mittens that have a 32 up to a 36 stitch gauge. That is very, very tight. That's like entry level Latvian mittens. And yeah, you can use these kinds of yarns at a variety of different tensions. You can knit as tight as humanly possible, but also you can knit them really loose. You can knit them as loose as like 13 stitches per 10 centimeters, so you get a nice lofty shawl. Because when this yarn is woolen spun and it has quite a bite to it, you know, the yarn doesn't just kind of, it's not slick like superwash yarn, so it actually holds up really nicely and you get a very nice airy fabric. Try it out, swatch with Finull at various different gauges and you can see for yourself. It doesn't become necessarily sloppy or shapeless just because you go looser, because of the quality of the wool, which I think is really nice. So yeah, there isn't any set rule for gauges for different yarns, which is something I will get back to as well. I just thought it worth mentioning while we have this table up here. But yes, I will use yarns like Finull or, you know, Skeindeer on all those different gauges, and it's fine. You just get different fabrics. And that relates to the next point that I want to make, and that is the misconception I have come across a lot. So this misconception is, I used the same yarn but I had to go up a needle size to get gauge, and this gave me a looser fabric. No, it didn't. If you used the recommended yarn of the pattern but you had to go up a needle size to get the gauge that the pattern says, you didn't get a looser fabric than that pattern. You got the very same fabric, because gauge is the fabric. If you knit it as tight or loose as the pattern says, with the yarn that the designer used as well, you got the same fabric. You may personally feel that it was too loose, and that is totally fine. You may personally feel that it was too tight, but you did get just as a tight or just as a loose fabric as the designer got. So just because you had to go up a needle size doesn't mean that you got something looser to achieve gauge. That doesn't make any sense. You basically got the very same material. So hopefully that was clear. I've just come across this idea a lot, and I just want to burst that bubble a bit and make people a bit more confident when they get gauge. It's all right. And then you can make decisions about whether you actually want to have that fabric or not. And in which case, then yes, you will have to change needle size. Then we'll have to go up even more to knit even looser, or go down a bit to knit even tighter. And you may still be above the actual recommended needle size. Like when I'm knitting Tenya, and I'm actually knitting it at a tighter gauge, yet I still had to go up a needle size because Caitlin Hunter knits so much looser than I do. I would have had to go up even more in needle size if I wanted to achieve a looser gauge than hers, right? So you can see that on my table as well. Like say if I wanted, I'm knitting a pattern that says 3mm to get 24 stitch gauge, and I go up to 3.25. I am then getting a 28 stitch gauge, so I'm still knitting tighter even though I went up in needle size. So that is, you know, a thing to be aware of, that the actual number that your gauge gives you matters, not just going up in needle size, because you have to go up enough. So hopefully I made that clear. It is not the larger needle size that just makes it looser. It's actually a looser gauge, right? But you don't have to get gauge, of course. If you actually want a different fabric, then you have to go with a different gauge. But do be aware that, you know, the tighter it is, the stronger it is, which may or may not be relevant. Like, you know, if you're making socks, then it's quite relevant. So then I actually want to go a little bit more in depth into the idea of swatching, because immediately as I talk about gauge, which I do a lot, people will then just tell me, oh, gauge, I don't want to swatch. Or, oh, Ellie, you're just so technical. I don't really care about that stuff. I just want to knit. And I'm like, it still matters though. But I want to make it very clear that gauge does not equal swatching. So like, it will still affect the size of what you get. Like, notice how I never advocate for actually swatching for my mitten patterns or my sock patterns, but I'm still writing a plethora of gauges that will result in different sizes in the patterns. That doesn't mean I expect you to swatch. It just means that different gauges will give different sizes. And that is true for every sock pattern and mitten pattern out there. It's just that I actually specify how the gauge will result in different sizes. even if that wasn't written, that would still be the case. So just sometimes if you do an accessory and you don't want to swatch for an accessory, just start knitting. Knit it and measure as you go. Yes, you may want to block it first to make sure it's the same gauge, because gauge does tend to kind of show its true self once it's been blocked. But it still matters. It would always matter, even if you don't want to swatch for it because you don't see it worthwhile in terms of fit or in terms of the size of the item. You will still get a gauge that will make an item bigger or smaller, or of course the same size as the given pattern if you are knitting at the same tension. So just to repeat myself, swatch does not equal gauge, gauge does not equal swatch. But if you do swatch, then yes, do make sure that you always knit the swatch the way you knit the project. So I'm going to just read up a few examples. You need to use the same needle material. I'm going to put in a bit of a nice illustration here that I came across when Googling years ago. It is, I will put the name below, who actually made this. And she tried out different needle sizes to see how that affected both stitch gauge and row gauge, and found that it changed both. So wood needle seems to make stuff shorter but wider, and I do always keep that in mind. If I can't get gauge sometimes, if I had to get a 24 stitch gauge or 26 stitch gauge but I need 25, I might choose a needle size that gives me 26, but I will use a wooden needle. Of course I should swatch with that and see if that works, but usually I just kind of do it anyway, because yes, needle material does affect your gauge. So do make sure that when you swatch with the same needle size. And if you're doing a pair of socks or mittens, use the same needles for both. Please do. And you need to make sure that you swatch with the same method. So if you're going to knit a piece in the round, and do swatch in the round. If you're going to knit a piece flat, then you have to swatch flat, because your purling may differ from your knitting. And you need to make sure that you swatch the textures used. So if the pattern comes in different textures, and you will usually have to swatch all the textures. I mean, most of the time you can kind of assume that if the designer got the same gauge with the variety of textures, you will too, but that may not apply. Kind of makes me want to refer again back to my table. I always have to go up in needle size for color work, because that change in texture or the method of stranding affects my gauge to make it tighter. But for other people, actually it makes it looser, so they have to go down in needle size for color work, and it may not be as proportional as I have to. So for that, you have to swatch. There's only one way of finding out, is swatching, I'm afraid. Or, you know, you may enjoy swatching. I shouldn't add any judgment or value to that. And of course you need to swatch with the same yarn. That is hopefully a given. You need also to make sure that you block your swatch, because you will also block your final item, I assume. And even if you don't, the reason why we block is to make the item we have knitted reach the point it will reach when it's been worn quite a bit, because the yarn will eventually relax and so find its proportion and how it wants to be. And that is kind of what you do with blocking. You're taking a shortcut to make it get to that point right away. And so that is why you swatch the block, because you're trying to make that fabric square into what your garment will be after you've had it for a while and it's sort of, you know, revealed its true self, so to speak. But swatch may still don't actually reflect your final gauge. Swatches can lie. And sometimes, like, do you remember I was doing this top-down raglan? I was my first attempt to the improv sweater, I believe, and I was trying to incorporate the brick sweater as well. And I was knitting the raglan in the round top-down. So, you know, you cast on for the neck and you go around and around and you work up the 2 raglan seams on each side. So you've got sleeve caps coming out with the body. I assume you know how a raglan works. But when I measured my gauge while knitting it, I always consistently had a tighter gauge on these sections than the front and the back. The sleeves had a tighter gauge than front and back. And I think it was the seams that held it together. So you create a seam when you increase on each side of a stitch or 2 stitches. You just kind of change the tension of the fabric there, because you pull up a stitch and you knit into it twisted. So that the gauge actually in that particular section is a little bit tighter, and that seems to have like pulled things a little bit here to make it a bit more contained, whereas here it could flare out a little bit. That is kind of my thinking. So yeah, sometimes a swatch can't predict that kind of thing. So swatching can be, that doesn't mean that swatching is redundant, that is just never going to tell you the truth, so don't do it. It still is usually the best way forward. But yeah, it doesn't always reflect the truth. For me, it rarely does, so I tend to prefer just casting on and knitting, and if worst comes to worst, I will just have to rip it out and start again. And sometimes also your swatch may differ from magic loop to knitting in the round, and that is another reason I don't like swatching, because I don't knit with magic loop necessarily. I will just knit with a very big circular for the yoke, and then I'll have small circulars for the sleeves. So I would then have to swatch a piece that's big enough to be worked with that kind of needle. And for that I tend to do a swatch where I carry the floats in the back, or I actually break the yarn after each row so I can always work the rows from the front. That's of course individual preference, but that seems to reflect my gauge the best actually. So basically I work a flat piece, but I break the yarn at the end of each row and start again. Or I will carry the yarn all the way around and join again. Kind of, it's the same thing. But in cases where you actually do find that you are knitting your garment and you're knitting it according to your swatch, you get engaged for the entire thing except the sleeves. Because you work the sleeves maybe on magic loop or small circulars or what have you, DPNs possibly, and you find that the sleeves give you a tighter gauge. Go up a needle size. And you think, oh, but doesn't that give you a looser fabric? No, we covered that earlier. It's not going to look different. It's going to look different if you do not go up a needle size, however. That is when it will look different. But going up a needle size to achieve the same gauge on the sleeves as you did with the body will actually not look different at all. That is why you would go up a needle size for the sleeves, if magic loop makes it tighter or DPNs make it tighter, or if it makes it looser, you go down for the sleeves. I had a lot of concerned souls wanting me to cover row gauge. And I agree with you, row gauge is a pain. I hate row gauge, but that is because it's close to impossible to match stitch gauge and row gauge at the same time. So I would advise you to focus on stitch gauge. The most important thing is to get stitch gauge. I'm not saying that as if row gauge doesn't matter, because row gauge does matter, but stitch gauge I would argue more so. So some might argue that actually try to get row gauge and then you can just add more stitches to get something that will result in the same stitch gauge, but you don't get the same fabric. So I don't know. I don't agree with that, but of course row gauge affects your fabric as well, so you're kind of back to the same story there. You see why row gauge gets very confusing very quickly. So I'm gonna try to disentangle some row gauge issues. You can get away with it by adding and subtracting rows, and you have to do some maths in order to do so. So I personally feel quite strongly that designers should, whenever possible, write patterns in inches or centimeters rather than rows. Whenever that is, there's a room for that, please do that. Like say the decreases for the sleeve, instead of saying decrease every 8 row, say decrease every, I don't know, 2.5 centimeters. So 2.5 centimeters, it's quite, you know, it's the same for everyone. But if I have a shorter row gauge than you, then those 2.5 centimeters will be a bit shorter, and I will suddenly be done decreasing right about here. And so my sleeve, it's tight here when it really should have been that tightness all the way down here. You see, that can become a problem quite quickly when your increases kind of gets shoved up into one end, because the knitter just obediently follows the number of rows and they're completely off on row gauge. And yes, of course they should have checked row gauge already, but that is the kind of pitfall if you don't. So I feel like it would have helped so many knitters if that was just written as, say, oh, decrease for the sleeves every 2.5 centimeters. That is 1 inch, by the way. Decrease every inch, brackets approximately 8 rows. So then you are, with very few words and symbols, saying that the number of rows is peripheral to the actual length between each decrease, right? I think that would help so many of us. But of course in some cases you just can't change the number of rows. Like say, oh, I can use this as an example. My very funny kind of cat-shaped cardigan. I am working down the sleeve holes here. It has a stick in the middle, but there is a hole here once we just cut that up, like so. I will have to give the number of rows here, because we are picking up stitches. That will become the stitch count for the sleeves, right? And so that has to correspond. So in this case, I have no way around it. A pattern like this that uses a satin sleeve will often be written in number of rows, and so you kind of have to get row gauge. But if you can't, because how do you do that when you have reached stitch gauge and you can't really change more than that? Well, you may have to do some maths, like I said. So let's say you have a pattern that gives you a row gauge of 34 rows per 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and the pattern asks you to knit 68 rows, and according to the pattern that will be 20 centimeters, and you can find out if you say 20 times 3.4. 3.4 reflects the number of rows per centimeters, and 34 is the number of rows per 10 centimeters. And 20 times 3.4 is 68 rows. Or conversely, if you do 68 divided by 3.4, you find out, oh, those 68 rows will give me 20 centimeters. But I am off in row gauge. I am getting 30 rows per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So you're off by row gauge, but then what do you really do? Well, you can actually take 3 times 20 to find that you need 60 rows. So what that means, basically we're taking 3 because 3.0 is the 30 row gauge that you have. The 30 rows per 10 centimeters times 2 is 60. So you have to knit 60 rows to get to the 20 centimeter length. It's a bit annoying that you have to do all this math because the designer insisted on writing in rows rather than in the measurements, but there you go. That is the kind of maths that you will have to do if you are off by row gauge and you really can't go any other way. However, you don't always have to change anything because the row gauge is always going to be a higher number than the stitch gauge. Like say when I have my Vinterfjell sweater, it has a row gauge of 34 rows per 10 centimeters, but a stitch gauge of 24 stitches. So the difference between say 34 and 32 rows is very minuscule. So if you have a 32 row gauge rather than 34, you will get 21.25 centimeters rather than 20. So you will have 1.25 centimeters more than you should have. I don't really care about that small effect, so I usually just leave that if I'm just off by a bit. That doesn't matter so much. It will of course matter in the long run if the entire piece is done in rows, and that little 1.25 centimeters will happen again and again and again for every 10 centimeters that you should have reached. So at some point of course it will make a difference, but often there are only sections that are written in rows rather than the measurements, and then actually you'll be fine. So I will urge you to focus mostly on stitch gauge and don't fret if you can't get row gauge. Like, never let that keep you from actually casting on, you know. This is why I always feel a bit doubtful about including row gauge in my patterns, because it's great for troubleshooting, right? If you actually found that, oh, something went horribly wrong here, what was that? And then you look at row gauge and like, oh. But before starting, looking at row gauge can often just confuse you more than help you, because people just fret and go, oh, I have to get both. No, I write most of my patterns in terms of the actual measurement that you have to reach, which some would argue is also wrong because that could change with blocking. In which case, that is why it's good to have a swatch, because if you found that your row gauge changed before and after blocking, so that's gonna be actually quite good to measure your swatch before blocking as well, to know the difference. For that case, actually you can see, oh, my row gauge changed this much before and after blocking, so I know that's how much my actual garment will change after blocking, and you can measure that with that in mind. To be more precise, that will require more maths, but hopefully you'll be fine. So that was my gripe with row gauge, keeping that quite brief and moving on to another misconception I have come across a lot, and that is, oh, can I just knit a smaller size than I need and it can be larger if I go up in yarn weight? Not quite. Maybe, but not quite. It's the needle size that is the primary influence on your gauge, not the yarn weight. You may actually find that knitting with a worsted weight on a 4mm gives a different gauge to knitting and a 4-ply fingering weight yarn on a 4mm. So maybe then you got a looser gauge with the worsted weight and therefore it will allow you to do a larger size. Sure. But more often than not, actually going up in yarn weight makes something tighter. So if you chose to do a smaller size than yours and you went with thicker yarn, you may actually get something even tighter, even smaller. But it is totally possible to knit a smaller size than you need to make it larger by knitting a looser gauge. But you really need to take ownership over your gauge and not just like throw in a thicker yarn and hoping that that's going to do the trick. You really have to go technical here and swatch with that yarn and see what gauge is that giving you, and do the maths that I just told you with row gauge. You can do that with stitch gauge as well. You say, oh, I got a 22 stitch gauge rather than 24, and so the stitch count of the smaller bust size I can now divide upon 2.2 rather than 2.4. If I get 2.4, I get the size that it says on the pattern. But if I divide on 2.2, the measurements will change and you have actually the size that would fit you. But again, you need to do the maths there. You can't just change the yarn weight and hoping that will do the trick, because that is a gamble, a very big gamble. So stay safe, do swatches, measure them, do the maths. And it's not very hard maths. It never ever gets more complicated than multiplying and dividing, promise you. It's, if you can do percentage calculations, you're good. If not, if you have any sort of dyscalculus or other sort of mathematical or numerical difficulties, I'm sorry, that's just knitting. Knitting is maths, knitting is numbers. I don't really have any comforting words for that other than you have my full understanding. And the last misconception for this video, and this one I find is particularly common in Scandinavia, where people are very much knitting from the big commercial companies and using commercial yarns, and you'll find that the commercial companies always use the same gauge with their yarn. Like some knitters will always knit sisu with the 27 stitch gauge, and then you find a designer who's chosen to use sisu but at a 24 stitch gauge, and someone is bound to send that designer an angry private message saying, you knitted that yarn with the wrong gauge, it's not supposed to be knitted at that gauge, the ball band says 27 stitches, not 24 per 10 centimeters. No, again, going back to how flexibly I can use feenul, that to some extent applies to all yarns, right? There isn't really a set rule for how loosely or how tightly you can knit it. It depends on the fabric that you want, with the yarn that you're using. And most yarns can be used at a vastly greater range of gauges than the ball band says. The ball band isn't truth. It's not like you can only choose the gauge and the needle size written on the ball band. Don't let that restrict you. Don't let that dictate what you can knit. Don't let that dictate what indie designers can do. I've never had that problem, by the way. It's just stories I've been told multiple times that people seem to think that a yarn has a given gauge and that is the only gauge you can knit that yarn with, and also that that yarn will always result in that gauge, which I think you have learned after this video that is not the case. It always comes down to your tension, and the way you handle that tension is by choosing different needle sizes and possibly also doing the maths. So that is all I have to say for today. I hope that wasn't too big of a mouthful. I totally understand if you may have to go back and pause and rewind, take notes. I will let you know that YouTube has a slow down feature. I have sadly clinically a very short verbal memory, so I speak fast so that I can remember the beginning of my sentence as I am finishing that very sentence. But you can slow down videos on YouTube. It has the little mechanical wheel icon, I think, and then you can choose different speeds and you can hear me talk very slowly. It doesn't actually affect the sound of your voice, it just affects the speed, which I think is really well done. So I quite appreciate that feature, although me with my verbal memory, I tend to speed things up rather than slow them down. So that is all I have for this episode. Before I finish off, I have a bit of a funny story to tell you, because while I was recording this, I think it was right when I was ready to talk about row gauge, you may have noticed a bit of a change. The postman rang. He had some, wasn't the postman, it was the delivery. Who had delivery for my flatmate. And I opened, I helped him get the parcels in, and the wind made the door shut. And I thought, what do I do? Nobody's home, what do I do? Nobody can leave work and come and help me. I don't even have my phone, I can't reach them. Help. Then I saw that my neighbors had their door open, and we actually share a balcony with them on the other side of the building, where my flatmates sometimes leave the door open when I am home, even if she isn't. And I knocked on the door and I knocked on the door, and their cleaner was there, so they weren't actually home, and she did not want to let me through because obviously she's not allowed to. And I'm like trying to figure out what we can do, and she's trying to call out the people that live there and my neighbors, and they didn't answer, and I'm like, oh, what do I do? And she's like, I can't let you in, I'm sorry. And of course I realized in the end that I could actually have her walk through my flat and open the door from the inside, and she did. What a relief. Oh, thank you, cleaner, you are my savior. I don't know what to say. That was absolutely ridiculous, and you can imagine the panic on my face, right? Anyway, that is all I have for this episode. I'm now gonna go find a nice air-conditioned coffee shop and sit there until I am done melting, because it is, oh god, it's terrible. I am so gross. Thank you for watching and for putting up with my hot weather is unbearable to the poor Scandinavian nonsense, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.